Eric Schmidt left his top position at Google in 2017, but today he seems to be even more popular as an expert, appearing as a guest at more conferences than he did when he was a CEO at Google. More recently, he spoke at the 2024 edition of the Future Investment Initiative. As he often does at events, he shared his vision of future scenarios in a compelling way. His introductory remarks focused on the competition between the two global leaders in AI and the critical importance of winning the race to artificial general intelligence.
And what you're seeing now is you're seeing fundamentally a global race between the US and her allies and China and her allies. And I think it's fair to say that both countries are going to be clear winners in this revolution. And this revolution is of a scale larger than the PC revolution, as larger than the internet revolution, because it's a revolution about intelligence. To me, the key question is not what happens in the US and China, because we can talk about that, it's pretty clear, but what happens to the other 195 countries, right? It is not at all clear to me how that organizes. Software in general is inexpensive, easy to use, hard to control, and distributed very broadly. In this particular case of AI, the presence of very large pools of capital and energy and the ability to build the data centers will be a key point. Saudi, by the way, could be one of those great winners if Saudi does the right things. So the thought experiment is, imagine that there's a secret lab in China that invents something with that kind of flexibility well ahead of the West. Just imagine that. And remember, it would have Chinese values, Chinese rules, which are very different from Western democratic views. In that scenario, what could occur? So this is a system in our fiction, because we don't know it yet, that could, for example, imagine how to change the world's financial system and the way the banks work. It could figure out a bug in the way the banks talk to each other. It could, for example, suggest a new, they're called zero-day cyber attacks. These are unknown attacks on cyber infrastructure. We just don't know. And so all of us who work on this believe very strongly that the West, and in particular the United States, needs to invent this very, very quickly. It is, in fact, a race. The fact that we would get there first does not mean that somehow our opponent, in this case China, is vanquished, but it does mean that you can set the agenda.
In previous speeches at various events, Schmidt expressed concern about the slow pace at which governments are adopting AI in some areas, particularly in defense. At this event, he reaffirmed those views.
I'm somewhat cynical about military people and organizations because I spend so much time with them. And the reason I'm cynical is not because the people are bad, they're very, very good people, but because the system is precisely wrong for this kind of a scenario. The entire universe, the entire floor of what you do is changing, and yet the organization, the organizational structure, the priorities, the political structures are not changing. So a typical example is that in conflict, it's obvious if you're a technology computer scientist that future wars will be used with devices that are attritable, multiple, very, very short-term, and very, very mobile. Things like aircraft carriers are exactly the opposite of that, right? So when people like me think about this, we think about why don't you, in fact, build a drone army and deal with things autonomously? So autonomy plus essentially getting abundance is the correct strategy. Militaries are not organized around that. So my view on the AI regulation question is that it will be very difficult for governments to follow what's going on, but it will also be very difficult for governments to adopt them unless they have secret labs and so forth, which operate differently from the current military.
One scenario that could accelerate the modernization of the military is not one we want to face: war. For example, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia has pushed both countries to adapt at an impressive pace. Take a listen.
The way it really works is both sides are at incredible speeds innovating. And the general rule in Ukraine is that any idea on one side is adopted by the other side within 3 to 6 weeks, because they're both watching each other. And Russian tactics have recently changed to copy Ukrainian ones. Ukrainians have recently adopted some Russian ones and so forth. One of the big surprises for me in Ukraine has been the rate at which Russia, which has historically been non-innovative, would be an understatement, have, under the enormous pressure of the war that they started, they really are changing their own definition of war. They built these huge factories for drones. They took technology from Iran and others and have perfected it, make it stronger. If you look at the drone tactics are changing every day. When you talk to the commanders, they say you actually have to be in the field because the war is changing so quickly. Both sides are learning how to, and I'm not endorsing this, it's obviously horrific. For those of you who've never actually seen a real war, one, I don't recommend it, and two, they're much worse than you think. So the way this is a land war, it's a World War I land war, and you have one side and another side. Neither side has air dominance, and essentially one has sea dominance because of sea drones, and that's Ukraine. The front line is about 10 kilometers wide. Normally, sometimes it gets down to half of a kilometer. And those things are death zones. They're the most mined facilities in the world. They're mined because both sides don't want vehicles going back and forth. As you all know, the world has an awful lot of tanks. Those tanks are largely useless now. A $5,000 drone can destroy a $5 million tank. I read somewhere that the US had thousands and thousands of tanks stored somewhere. Give them away, right? Buy a drone instead. In fact, buy 10, buy 20, buy 50, buy 100. So the cost of autonomy has fallen so quickly that the drone war, which is the future of conflict, will get rid of eventually tanks, artillery, and mortars. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that conflict goes away. I just think it changes.
During a previous panel at the same event, Schmidt offered further insights, even envisioning the end of land warfare.
War is today defined stereotypically as man, gun, shooting, other man shooting, trying to kill each other. If you're a computer scientist, this makes absolutely no sense. The guns should be automated, and the people should be drinking coffee somewhere else. And that simple description of war is now occurring in Ukraine. It's not occurring in pretty much anywhere else because governments and militaries are not ready for this technological change. But in Ukraine, they have no choice, largely due to lack of a navy and lack of an air force. So today you have a battle for air dominance and a battle for sea dominance. And in the case of Ukraine, they're doing it with drones. And drones are essentially robots. If you are a roboticist, the fastest path to robots is in fact drone warfare, I'm sorry to say. And in the Ukraine fight, the boundary, the FLOT as it's called, is so crowded with drones that the biggest problem is figuring out whose drone is which. And there are drone management systems, and they're watching each other, and everybody's trying to shoot each other's down. There are enormous implications for the arrival of drone warfare because we've never had a situation where the morality of sitting somewhere else and doing this is exposed strategically in terms of moral choices. And furthermore, once these systems are fully automated, it's not at all clear how you do deterrence, right? I have a fully automated system and you have a fully automated system. How do we determine how we resolve these conflicts? My own view is that drone warfare will largely stop land wars, and that conflict will not go away, but it'll occur in different domains. The simplest way to understand it is that the drone world, think of them as a robot world. So if I say robots, you become afraid because you saw those movies. Drones are much more deadly, right? So this drone world is in air and sea right now. Land drones are coming, and I've seen them in use, are in fact in a network. So the steps are, first, a man, a target, and the use of a drone to target it. The next one is a flock, right, a swarm, technically, of drones launched against the same target. The next step after that is a readiness system where the drones are ready. The computer figures out if the threat's coming, launches the drones, and they serve as air defense. Those are the tactics that the US Air Force developed, 70 years ago in World War II. You're seeing that now in drones. Today, Ukraine is ahead of Russia, but not by much in those tactics. So I think a reasonable conclusion is that in any future conflict, both sides will end up with that outcome. And I should say that I don't know what happens in a deterrence regime when both sides have automatic networks of drones. If you look at the literature and the thinking, people have not thought through what it means to have those systems on a hair trigger. This is the new deterrence problem. And in Henry or Dr. Kissinger's memory, he pioneered all of this thinking in the 1950s around mutually assured destruction. We don't have an equivalent dogma, equivalent doctrine yet.
Schmidt also had some remarks for the host country, who is positioned to be a winner in the AI race.
My understanding is that many of the countries in this region are in conflict with Iran. And so if you think about the most valuable assets here, they're easily targeted by drones, right? Because they're not moving, and we know where they are, et cetera. And indeed, there were Iranian attacks in this country some years ago. So a reasonable expectation is that all of the national security components within these regions will ultimately be protected in a military sense. And I think usually the correct answer will be drones, and all sorts of different kinds. This country is uniquely positioned to provide leadership in AI because of the abundance of power, a very clear leadership regime that really wants to build it, and the both financing and sort of correct connectivity, correct weather, and so forth and so on, lots of sun, renewables. So there's every reason to think that Saudi in particular can become one of the winners, one of the big winners here, if the country puts the money that's in place now wisely and quickly. There are discussions within the government here about how to do that, who will organize it. I'll let them talk about it, but they look roughly right to me. So it looks to me like Saudi's on the right path. The simplest thing for this country to win is to use its abundant resources and create facilities that no one else can build. There is a huge shortage of electricity in the developed world. The U.S., one estimate is the U.S. will run out of electricity for the kind of stuff I do by 2028. As you know, Europe and Britain, the electricity costs are so high. There's every reason to think that the training and the inference can be done here with the right networks, the right data centers, and so forth. And that's what I think all of us want this country to do.
To conclude on a positive note, Schmidt reminded the audience of the incredible opportunities AI will bring. Although he didn't have time to elaborate on these benefits, you can hear more of his thoughts in another video we published previously, which you can find at the link above.
To say it is, you have enormous optimism and enormous concern, and they're both correct. Enormous optimism because the arrival of a new intelligence that is our partner, that makes each and every one of us as brilliant as the best physicists, the best chemists, the best artists, and so forth. Our lives will be changed forever, and it'll occur in our lifetimes. The optimism in terms of health, education, the development of your children and your grandchildren is enormous. You cannot imagine what that is. The same thing is also true for threats against us. So, for example, access to AGI by a terrorist. How do you make sure that a terrorist group cannot get such enormous power in an asymmetric way into their hands? These are the great national security issues for the future.